Okay, so this is a presentation with my colleagues from the UK. So you can see there my colleagues who worked with me on this project. I was very lucky, in fact, to be working with, next to me you can see a photo of Jordan Fenlon. He is the first deaf person from a deaf family with a PhD in linguistics. So I was very lucky to be working with him while I was working in Britain on the project. Now I'm back home in Australia. I'm originally from Australia, and the reason I was able to work on British Sign Language was because British Sign Language, Australian Sign Language, and New Zealand Sign Language are all really sign languages within the same family. In fact, you might want to consider them to be dialects of the same sign language. So first of all, I want to talk a little bit about what a corpus is. And a corpus is very much part of adequate language documentation. And a corpus is a collection of language recordings from a representative sample of the community with a mix of different language samples, stories, conversations, etc., that can be searched by computer and can be shared as a reference for research, for a number of different research projects. Corpora for sign languages have only really become possible in the last decade with the arrival of video annotation software such as ELAN. In ELAN, you can align written annotations with segments of the video. And if I have time, I might show you an example a bit later. Why was a corpus project of BSL necessary? Well, for the reasons that we heard before, which relate to the need for adequate language documentation. So even though there has been a lot of work on British Sign Language, in fact, going right back to the 1970s, there really isn't adequate documentation of the language. There is an introductory book on sign linguistics of British Sign Language, but it isn't really a comprehensive grammar book of the language. There's one dictionary, but that was completed 20 years ago. There's not been any work since, and it contains fewer than 2,000 signs. It really does not represent an adequate documentation of the vocabulary of British Sign Language. And also, we weren't just interested in language documentation projects for theoretical reasons. Obviously, there is a major theoretical interest in sign languages that Woody talked about earlier, which is the fact that these are a unique type of language and they're of great interest to theoretical linguists. But there's also a desire on the part of the deaf community in Britain to document the language better. Because British Sign Language, like a lot of other sign languages, has a great deal of variation. There are differences in the signs that are used in different parts of the UK, differences between people of different ages, etc., etc. So there's a lot of variation in the language, but that variation seems to be changing, and some of the traditional signs are being lost before they're properly documented. And there's a lot of awareness and concern about this in the British deaf community, because one of the big employment areas for deaf people in Britain is teaching British Sign Language. A large number of deaf people teach British Sign Language. It's a very popular subject. Many hearing people. In fact, people estimate that maybe 250,000 people in Britain have studied British Sign Language at some point. And one big problem for sign language teaching is which signs should we teach? Okay. Which signs are the most common in the language? Which signs represent signs that are used in my region and not another region? There's a lot of ongoing debate and discussion in the British deaf community about this issue. Also, I was working at the Deafness, Cognition and Language Research Centre, which is quite a unique centre at University College London, where linguists work with psychologists and neuroscientists to understand the relationship between deafness, cognition, and sign language. And yet, as Yutaka was saying before, I feel that a lot of this research is coming too early, in a sense, because we need to understand British Sign Language much, much better before we can use it in a lot of these applied areas, so these studies of psycholinguistics, of neuroscience, etc. So the aim of the British Sign Language Corpus project was to create an online open access collection of BSL video data. We got funding from the British government in 2008 to begin this project, but unfortunately there were no research grants at the time that could provide funding simply for the creation of a corpus. You had to do specific research projects at the same time. So simultaneously as we collected the data, we also prepared to use the data to study BSL variation and change, and also lexical frequency, because these two areas are of particular interest to British Sign Language teachers. They want to know about the variation, they want to know about how that variation is changing, and they want to know which signs are the most common in the language. So the project started in January 2008 and ran until June 2011 last year. Very important to say here that it wasn't the first sign language corpus project, and in fact before I moved to the UK I worked with Trevor Johnston on the Australian Sign Language Corpus project, and this was the inspiration for the project that I worked on in Britain. So what did we do? Well, due to the time constraints and due to funding limitations, we couldn't go to every region in the UK and collect data from signers in every region. We know that there are lots of dialects within the UK. We don't know how many different dialects of BSL there are, but we know that there are very many. So we decided to just start with a subset of the regional dialects in British Sign Language. So we chose 8 cities across the UK. First of all, we have to remember that the UK is not one country, but actually 4 countries. So we had to represent each of those 4 countries. So we had sites in England, and also one in Wales, one in Scotland, and one in Northern Ireland. England, however, is the largest population-wise, has the largest proportion of deaf people, so we chose 5 cities in the UK. London, of course, as the capital in the southeast, Bristol in the southwest, Birmingham in the Midlands, in the middle region of England, Newcastle in the northeast, and Manchester in the northwest. All these cities have strong deaf communities with strong deaf community centres, and have or have had in the past a residential school for deaf children. We filmed 30 people from each city because we wanted to balance the number of men and women, deaf people from deaf families, deaf people from hearing families, professional deaf people who worked as language teachers, and more working class deaf people who worked in factories or trades. So we wanted to get a mixture of people. We only filmed deaf people who were native signers. That means deaf people who had learnt BSL from birth, from deaf parents, or near native signers, those who had learnt to sign before the age of 7. Because of the regional variation, we tried to focus on people who had lived in that region for 10 years or more. We favoured people who were lifelong residents of that region, but that wasn't always easy to find, lifelong residents. People move around. And we filmed people in different age groups. The youngest person we filmed was about 16. The oldest person we filmed was about 89. And we had balanced numbers in each of the age groups. We also tried to include 10% of our sample as non-white British people, so mostly people of Afro-Caribbean or South Asian background. And we also included about 1/3 of people having deaf parents and 2/3 having hearing parents. Now that's much larger, that's not representative, of course, it's a much larger proportion than is actually in the adult deaf community. But we wanted the native signers to be very well represented. We recruited everyone by using deaf community field workers. They were deaf people who lived in the 8 cities, and they recruited all the people that we filmed. So we filmed 249 deaf people. No hearing people were present during the filming. That was very important. So it was only deaf people with other deaf people in the filming. We filmed people in pairs. Now, if you're doing the mental math, you might be thinking, you filmed everyone in pairs, that doesn't get you 249. One person actually was filmed twice, because we made it our priority to film deaf people with their friends, people that they felt comfortable with. One person, it turned out, wasn't comfortable with the person she was filmed with the first time, so we found another person and filmed her again. So that's how we ended up with an odd number. We filmed people against a blue background, as you can see here. We asked people to wear dark tops so that their hands could be seen clearly. And in case people turned up wearing inappropriate clothing, we had t-shirts that were there ready for people to wear. And we were very strict about this. It did mean that we had to, something we didn't anticipate in the project was a laundry bill. Because we soon realized that we had to wash those t-shirts, the ones that we'd bought for people. That wasn't something that was in our budget, but... We filmed people in chairs without arms, because we find that people will often lean on the arms when they're signing, and that will interfere with their sign language production. We also did not film elderly, retired, married couples together. What we filmed people doing was we filmed 4 types of data. We filmed people telling stories, people being in an interview, people giving us their signs for 102 key concepts, and also 30 minutes of conversation. We didn't film retired married couples because they couldn't talk to each other for 30 minutes. Everything had been discussed at breakfast. There was nothing new to say. So we had to film friends, people who were friends with each other, rather than married couples. Okay, so where are we now? As I said, we filmed 249 participants, and we have put the data online, and I'm going to show you what the data look like now. But it's very important to say that this is just the first step. We have collected this data, we have translated some of the data into English, we have conducted 4 studies on aspects of the sign language data, but we've only actually annotated about 40,000 signs. We have hours and hours of data. We've only annotated a small percentage of that data. And so we have not made the annotations and the translations available to other researchers yet, because we need more time to finish that. We're currently awaiting to hear about further funding from, well, that was 4 applications, but it's now 3. Because we found out just this week we didn't get one of them, unfortunately. So we've got 3 more applications we're waiting for to continue the work. I'll show you what we've got so far for the British Sign Language Corpus project. I'll just quit the PowerPoint. Here you can see the website. At the moment, there are 2 ways to look at the data. If you are a casual user, you just want to see some of the signing, you're not a researcher, then you can access the data this way. So you can see here a map of the cities. We'll choose London. Now you can see there are 4 types of data. You'll see 2 of them are locked, conversation and interviews. They are not open access. Only researchers who sign a confidentiality agreement form get access to that data, because many of the deaf people actually start talking about personal things, or they gossip. They talk about who are good sign language users in the community, which interpreters they like, which interpreters they don't like, and they mention them by name. So we have this data is not open access. It's only, you have to be a bona fide researcher to see this data, and you have to sign a confidentiality agreement. But you can see the examples of the signs that people gave. We remember that we collected 102 signs from everybody. We chose signs that we know show a lot of variation across the country. So if you're interested in how people over 65 from London produce these signs, you can click here. Hopefully it will work. Okay, so here are 2 older men over 65 from London, and they're about to show you their sign for address. Address as in where you live. And you'll see that they have 2 signs. The man on the left, okay, signs that, but he also knows the other sign. So these are the signs. The first sign actually also means number in BSL. And the second sign also means live, as in where you live. So we have the data from all 249 signers available on the internet. But at this stage we have no English translations because we didn't have time to get this done in the first phase of the project. We have put the video data online really as a first step for the deaf community. But we hope in future to provide translations, etc. Okay, I believe I'm out of time, so I don't really have time to talk about what we found from the project. But if you're interested, you can ask me a question in question time, and I can tell you a little bit more about what we found in some of the research that we've done. But as I said, this is the first phase of the project. It's been very well received in the UK. We've got lots of feedback from the deaf community. Our website has had over 10,000 hits. So we're very pleased with what we've done so far, but we need to take it further to create a true corpus of British Sign Language and to document the language better. So thank you.
Thank you. We have 10 minutes approximately of question time. Yes, we have a question here.
Thank you. My name is Connie de Vos. I'll just wait for Adam to. Okay, eye contact.
Sorry.
Anyway, so I'm interested in the the identification of sign language families and also the delineation of dialects. And you mentioned that there's, in some lexical domains, there's more variation than in others. I was wondering whether you could tell a little bit more about that, because it might be really important to identify dialects in sign languages. Okay, thank you.
Yes, in the British Sign Language family, this is the same for Australian Sign Language, New Zealand Sign Language and British Sign Language. There are some semantic domains, some areas where there's a lot more variation. In British Sign Language, one of the areas is number signs, signs for numbers. The signs for 1 to 5 are pretty much the same all over the UK, but then the signs for 6 to 10 vary a great deal. So I can show you, for example, the sign for 6 in London, the sign for 6 in Bristol, and the sign for 6 in Manchester, okay, which are all different, even though those areas are all in England and are not very far. It takes you 1 hour and 40 minutes on the train to get to Bristol from London. Okay, so this is the sign for 6 in London, Bristol and Manchester. I'll sign them in that order. So the Manchester number system is very interesting. I'll show you the numbers 1 to 10 in Manchester. So it's like the fist is a base 5, and then you go through the same 1, 2, 3, 4, and you add it to the base, and then 10 is 2 of those fists. So it's a very interesting system. So number signs is one area, color signs is the other area. And it's interesting that we saw some color sign variation in Indonesian sign languages, because color signs are another variation. So for example, I can show you green in Bristol and green in London. So first I'll show you London and then Bristol. Green. So even though most of the vocabulary in British Sign Language is similar across, well, all 3 sign languages really, brother, sister, mother, father, a lot of those signs are the same in Australia, New Zealand and Britain. There are areas where there's considerable difference.
Can I respond to that?
Sure.
I was just wondering what do you think, what sort of motivates the variation within these specific semantic domains? Do you think it's something particular about the semantics of those signs, or whether it might have something to do with the fact that they lend themselves for iconicity? And whether there's any domains that are particularly conservative across the different dialects of BSL?
That's a good question. Kinship signs are very similar across all of, a lot of basic verbs seem to be very similar across the, all of the dialects of British Sign Language, Australian Sign Language and New Zealand Sign Language. So some of those things are things you would expect to be similar. But I'm not sure why colours are so highly variable. I think obviously with numbers you've got different possibilities with finger combinations. So obviously with numbers there are different ways to represent those numbers iconically by extending different types of fingers. So you can see why that would work that way. But colours I'm not sure about. It might be because I'm not really sure. Trevor has an answer.
I don't have an answer, but I'd like to contribute. It seems to me that the numbers vary a lot in lots of sign languages in various areas, and I've always found that sports is a very important part of deaf communities, at least in Australia and Britain. And so the local area sport teams, they develop the number systems to record the scoring. That's one thing. The colours, I've found that in many sign languages, the colour terms are actually quite limited. And I think colours have lent themselves to educators as the very first thing they standardise and teach. And so you get them very regional variations for colours. Whereas family terms, everyday terms, basic verbs, these are everyday people's lives. And there's less impact of the education system on it. But that's a suggestion.
I mean, it's interesting, just if I can comment again, it's interesting that in American Sign Language, the colour signs are very standardised, but that's because a lot of them are based on initials of the English word. So you get, you know, Y in yellow, G in green, those kinds of things. But even the basic signs, black and white, I don't know, is there much regional variation in American Sign Language for black and white?
I'm Ulrike Sechan, and I wanted to add to the discussion, because the interesting thing is that across many countries the same semantic areas repeatedly have high variation, and it includes the numbers, it includes the colors, it also includes in many countries the weekdays and days of the month. Which in as much as they are not derived from these finger-spelled letters. So there is some kind of reason, and at the moment in our institute we are running a big typological study on semantic fields, which includes numbers, colors, and kinship. And so there will probably be a number of reasons emerging. Like, for example, for colors, you have a certain number of options how you generate your colors. They can iconically relate to objects. They can be based on finger spelling, like you said, for ASL, or they can be non-iconic, which is quite rare, actually. So, and like you said, for numbers, there's a certain set of options. So where you have that, and then weekdays might, you know, have different iconicity involved. So where you have various options where you derive your source signs from, that might lead to higher iconicity. And other countries I've seen, like India, Turkey, the verbs tend to be very similar, and you tend to have, and the function words like negators and question words tend to be very similar. So lots of things that make up the base of your grammar tend to be very similar, and then you get high lexical variability in other areas.
Haruka Bozono from Tokyo. What is striking about British English spoken language is that there are class dialects in addition to regional dialects. So working class English is quite different from middle class English, even in the same city, London, for example. And I was wondering if you have the same situation in this sign language in Britain.
We don't have any evidence of social class distinctions in British Sign Language. And I think that's because social class is only recently emerging in the British deaf community. For most of the 20th century, deaf people didn't have access to higher education. So there were no professional deaf people. Everyone who worked in a factory or at a trade. There were no educational opportunities for deaf people. So in a sense, everyone was working class. Obviously, there must have been differences in income, perhaps from family wealth, etc. But to my knowledge, the only way that that's possibly manifested in BSL is the fact that the most prestigious school in the UK is called Mary Hare Grammar School. It's a private school for deaf children, and people who are wealthy will send their deaf children there. And they have particular signs from that school. So that's the only kind of, if you went to Mary Hare Grammar, then you know certain signs. But that's the closest equivalent that we can find.
Thank you very much. It's now time to close the session, so let's... Thank you.